Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Curating Horror for Folks with Diverse Sensitivities panel, hosted by Gehenna Gaming, which would be all of us. Tonight, we're going to be talking about how to curate horror games for audiences of varying sensitivities to ensure everyone at the table is having a rewarding gaming experience. Particularly when it comes to horror games, this can be a challenge, and I think humble brag, we do a very good job of that. And I think that it's important to share how we approach it, as well as kind of the tips and tricks we've learned along the way, and the hurdles we've encountered. This panel is presented by Gehenna Gaming, and I am Ian E. Muller, or otherwise known as Ravnos online, co-founder and VP of Strategy for Gehenna Gaming. You probably have seen me on. I know we're not streaming. We're good. Shoot. Probably see me on our Twitch channel, which we are not streaming to currently. I was just informed, but I already knew that. And or at any of the conventions we have run games at, like PAX Unplugged, PAX East. I've been to, and several others, including our own Virtual HorrorCon, which we ran earlier this year as the pandemic started. And to my stage left is Mark.
Hello, I'm Mark Anderson. I'm the VP and co-founder, VP of Marketing and co-founder of Gehenna Gaming. I've been a part of Gehenna Gaming for now 1 year and 4 months exactly. And since then, we made a huge amount of groundwork in terms of developing our brand, doing quite a lot of the online and offline conventions, obviously before the apocalypse. And you will see me online if you engage with the Gehenna Gaming social media anywhere. You're either talking to me or talking to Ian. And yeah, this is something that we all feel passionate about. And these three folks over here are fantastic to chat about horror with. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. And below Mark on my screen is Bran.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Bran Reardon-Schmidt. I'm I'm one of the master storytellers with Gehenna Gaming. I also run a stream every Wednesday. And I am really bad at time, so I don't recall how long I've been a member of GG, but not very long. Pretty new here. But I didn't realize how much I loved horror until I met these goons. And they, really opened my eyes to all the wonderful things it can be, and that all the skills that I already had to run the horror. So we've become quite passionate about that. If you are on our Discord at all, you can find me as Bran or Bean. Bean is a pretty common moniker for me there, including my face. And you can find me on Twitter at Kathakaros.
Last but not least.
Hey, my name is Rick Wheeler. I am the VP and co-founder of Gehenna Gaming. I'm the VP of Content Development, one-shots, pre-gen characters, fun things like that. Write a bunch of stuff for our friends. Yes, so Bran has been with us since PAX East.
PAX East, yeah.
7 months. So you've pretty much been a part of our crew since the entire COVID.
Officially part of our crew.
Yeah. Yes, officially. It's been a long time family member in the Gehenna Gaming community. Like Ian and Mark, we got this thing off the ground. We love horror tabletop gaming. And we soon discovered that topics like this one are extremely important when running games for people from all walks of life, and how to make these games not only fun and memorable, but not traumatizing. This entire convention is about using tabletop gaming for therapy reasons. You don't want to run a horror game that's going to give someone reason to go to therapy. So that's what we're here to talk about. It's also World Mental Health Day. So that's fantastic.
It is. I didn't realize that it was World Mental Health Day. That's so apropos to this convention.
I feel like it was probably intentional. I certainly didn't realize it. So
yeah, that is probably intentional. I'm sure Bodano Group knew exactly what they were doing when they scheduled this con.
They're smart cookies, yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. So I'm going to be moderating this panel, so you're going to hear me talking a little bit, and then these guys a lot. But I'll open up right now to just each of you, starting with Mark. I want to kind of go over, like, what is horror to you?
Oh, that's a good question. First, I'm going to go with the macroverse, and then I'll go into the microverse. Horror is something that I firmly believe every single person is potentially a fan of in one form or another. Horror basically is a sudden uncomfortable feeling of shock and awe, maybe even disgust, and slight entertainment and fascination. You talk to anybody on the street about what it is that they enjoy as far as media goes, I guarantee you they're going to name at least one thing that could be kind of slightly interpreted as a subgenre of horror. My favorite example of this is true crime, because there are a lot of people who are very squeamish and don't like the whole like murder porn, guts and blood and all of that. However, are big fans or at least followers of and consumers of true crime. And I would say that that's horror. To me, I think that horror is also an aesthetic. That's extremely important to me. There is a feeling of liminalness, the not so A, not so B, kind of in the middle, can't quite put a definition on what it is that you're exactly looking at. So it gives you kind of a slight feeling of uncomfortability. And obviously, you know, shock for the sake of telling some kind of story or having some kind of symbol behind that kind of shock. That's my long answer. That's kind of it in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah.
Bran?
So horror for me, well, and Mark covered a lot of bases on that, because I'm really interested in human behavior, and I have been interested in human behavior for a long time. And so something about the way that horror touches on these things that you can't talk about normally, like it's like these little taboos, but is welcome to do so. It's this open conversation in which everyone's a little uncomfortable, but also kind of having fun. And I really enjoy that a lot. It's this moment of vulnerability between a group of people, especially in tabletop gaming. And, you know, it allows you to touch upon some things you just couldn't in life. So for me, I am much more not on the like high end of how what's the word I'm looking for here? I guess how vulgar the horror is. My preference lies toward that which is kind of primal, the thing that is in the shadows. That, did you just hear someone's voice? Did someone call your name? All these subtle things, this very folk horror is kind of my vibe. So horror for me is very much the stuff in the real world that your brain goes, there's something there, and you know there's not. But now you have the opportunity to explore it.
Fantastic. Rick?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Didn't want to step on your toes there. Horror, and what is it to me? Both of my fellow Gehenna people and panelists answered pretty well. And it's going to be hard to come up with an answer after these guys say their piece, because they're very intelligent. I think horror to me is those things that they mentioned, but also, I mean, I've always loved the supernatural and tales of the occult and cool things like that, things that are considered the other. I think I've developed a stronger, more adult love for horror when I actually got more interested in drama as an adult. When you have something to lose, you have something to fear. If you're watching a movie and you don't care about any of the characters, it's not really horror for you. It could be a slasher film like Friday the 13th, but if the one camp counselor who you're like, that person's not a dick and they're not messing with the kids and you hope they make it, you're rooting for that person throughout the whole film.
Yeah. You
develop an attachment, and life is about these attachments. Vampire's great with the touchstone system now. A lot of other games cause you, like Alien, pick a ally, pick a rival right off the bat. It's good to have those foundational relationships to your NPCs or your other player characters well established, because then, like, good drama is one thing, but I see horror as basically drama, but with more to lose, more at stake, and it's exciting. That's not to say that drama, romance, those things can be not exciting. I mean, every genre has its own pitfalls, But horror, there's always something more at stake. And I think telling tales about even the interpersonal horror of what you are, what have you become, or what are your real options, your choices in some really hard situations. I think writing horror, coming up with situations where you put your players in these circumstances where they have to make a choice, and both choices might really suck, and they still have to make one. How are they going to live with it? Why are they making that choice? I love seeing players get really engaged and involved in what they're doing, and they're not even thinking about this is horror, but they're worried, and hopefully not more than worried, but they care about what's happening. They don't want to do the wrong thing. They know that they're possibly going to damn themselves with whatever action's happening. That's the kind of horror I really like. And luckily for me, that can fit into just about any game. It's not locked into one particular system. So I'm going to stop there because I could keep going because I love horror.
I mean, everything all three of you said is fantastic, which is why I like working with you. I think that for me, what attracts me to the horror genre as a whole isn't so much the visceralness of it, or like the subgenres of like, sci-fi and slasher. It's the horror is one of the only genres of game, of media, that can evoke a incredibly broad range of emotions. I think more so than any other genre. Because you can go from laughing so hard you're crying to being incredibly terrified in a matter of a few minutes. We went from playing a Kult game last night that was horrifying to laughing our asses off this morning with They Came From Beyond the Grave. And being able to encapsulate those emotional reactions and create a game that I can curate to the players is what engages me with horror so much.
Yeah, it's dynamic, right? Like I was thinking about, and probably because Dixie mentioned vulgar displays of power, and it got me thinking about the idea of vulgarity, right? And how what is vulgar to one person, maybe not so vulgar to another. Right. I went and saw House of a Thousand Corpses in theaters when it first came out, and I've been following the production announcements and the marketing from the very beginning. Very, very excited about this movie. And then there were people that were like, I want to watch a scary movie with, my significant other. Let's go check this, whatever the hell this is, because it's got the word corpses in it. It's probably scary. And the movie itself has varying degrees of vulgarity and varying degrees of humor as well. So what certain audience members were finding funny, other audience members were going, oh my God, that's awful. And so it's like that line of vulgarity can kind of move between person to person. And when you're playing a tabletop game, you have all those people at the table. So curating to each one of them is extremely important, while at the same time ensuring that you're not alienating anybody.
Exactly. It's an interesting balancing act. I think we can touch more on that later, but overall, the horror genre spans every other genre in existence. There's comedy horror, there's sci-fi horror, there is fantasy horror. If you can think of a genre that isn't horror, I guarantee you there is a horror version of it. What are your favorites of those subgenres, and like why do those ones appeal to you over the others?
I would say body horror is a huge favorite of mine.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I love it. Part of it is because biology is weird. We're human. I mean, even eating food is an unusual experience if you really have some mindfulness involved with it. You're thinking about how your body works on a regular basis. I was explaining with my wife and I were sitting and flipping a book of anatomy with my daughter and saying, you know, these are bones and this is your brain and that kind of stuff. And there's a moment of like, this is a really weird activity to do with a 5-year-old. But, you know, you're teaching kids how to, you know, what's what in the human body and thinking about it in that kind of way. I have a brain, I have blood, I've got a nervous system. All of that feels so weird. And body horror kind of puts a mirror up to that and says, we are biological creatures that also think and have a certain sense of divinity involved in existence. And how strange is that?
Very.
That's probably my top favorite. I have others, but I will pass it over to my colleagues here.
Brian?
So my favorite genre. Is that what you're asking?
Subgenre, and then why?
Okay.
Like why that one speaks to you more.
So for me, I actually think that my favorite subgenre is probably more lines of the gritty dark fantasy. I really like dark fantasy because I feel like there's something innocent involved in fantasy, something whimsical involved in fantasy. It's very very exciting. You know, it's kind of like it's kind of almost like a little dance in my own mind. Like fantasy is very whimsical, and obviously there's a lot of varieties of it. But dark fantasy, I feel like takes that little whimsy, that little, and takes it from something large and makes it a tiny little spark, a single candle in the darkness. And it's this endless expanse of horrible stuff, but you're looking for good things. And, you know, sometimes the good thing is a delusion. And like, I think that's really messed up, but really cool. Like I think about like Pan's Labyrinth, for example.
Oh yeah.
You know, and that's my favorite subgenre of like horror like stuff is definitely dark fantasy. Yeah.
Awesome. Rick?
It's hard to put a pin in it. Which one, right?
First of all.
I mean, it somewhat depends on the setting, but I like the weird other. Kind of like the Call of Cthulhu, where you don't quite know what to expect. And I think Mark's way that he runs Kult is great for that. And it's the way that I see a game like Kult being played, where you enter a situation, a scenario, kind of like in the Kult scenario. What was it? It's not the tower.
The summit.
The summit, where every floor's got something a little different. I like how there are some games with horror where you literally turn the corner and there's something completely out of left field and different. So I think maybe psychological horror is my favorite. I love it when they not only see something they don't expect, but it doesn't react the way they expect. And I've kind of experimented with that a little bit in some of my games, especially with convention games, because it's like Kadoka, right? You got just a ton of people in one table and you change one or two things and you see what happens. I put something weird in a Call of Cthulhu game. The guy entered the kitchen, he sees a cultist with a knife and he immediately starts like running out and the guy doesn't follow him, doesn't even move. He just stands there holding the knife, like just out of it. And I remember asking all the people at the end of the game, like, oh, what was the creepiest part? Is the guy in the knife with the kitchen, like just the purpose of him and what he was doing there and why he didn't follow me. That's unsettling. You know, and I'm like, you know, like in my Freud chair going, yes, interesting.
He was making dinner.
Psychological horror.
Yeah.
To Bran's point earlier, why people think the way they do, why people act the way they do, and how you can kind of turn that on its head in horror when all of a sudden the logical is illogical. I like that.
Yeah, I feel you.
I think it's what scares me the most. Like if I were to look at what scares me, it wouldn't be like the creepy crawlies or like the gross body horror stuff. Like if I were to be kind of smack dab in the middle of a horror movie, the psychological horror stuff would really get to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. This will shock none of you. For me, it's cosmic horror and existential horror. It's horror that transcends our understanding of reality. The Cthulhu mythos, the movie Annihilation, all in the book series, obviously, all capture that really well. But it's that sense of not knowing if what you are experiencing is real. and having to keep going anyway. Because they're much like with dark fantasy, that's kind of like the glimmer of hope, even if it is a delusion, and it captures something that I think other genres touch on, but none of them do quite as well. It's often why I describe Alien as cosmic horror, not sci-fi horror.
Yeah. Can I ask something? How do you feel then about, I guess let's call it divine horror? Not so much kind of like religious cults. I mean, obviously, I probably know the answer to that, but divine horror, like you're meeting the difference between coming in contact with a very strange entity out of space and out of time, as opposed to coming in contact with God and smashes all of your expectations. I would
define that level of divine horror as a cosmic horror, because it's an unknowable being. A cult horror is OCCULT, not cult, is my second favorite genre. I love like Serpent in the Rainbow style, that level, because it also captures a lot of those essences as well. And I think that's where that crossover is too, because like you were saying, not cults but divine, but they actually can mesh. It depends on what direction it goes. So Mark, you started touching on this, and I veered the topic in a different direction because I wanted to discuss kind of what our take on horror is, so people could understand where we're coming from. But the topic of this really is curating horror, and I think it's important that we open with, why should you curate horror games at all in the first place? And I think there's an obvious answer, but there's also some very subtle, important differences to, like, well, because you don't want to hurt people. Like, it goes deeper than that, I think.
It does go deeper.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it does go deeper. There's a couple of things going on, right? You want everyone to have a good time. And that, I always look at it as far as the dialogue, where, yes, there should be some curation on the GM's end, but at the same time, the GM wants to run a game that they want to run, right? So understanding how to best curate that will ensure that you are also having a good time too. You obviously don't want to hurt people, but I think it's more that for me, I think it's extremely important that everybody is buying in, and that you're able to kind of create an experience for each and every individual. It's the same thing as when you're running a game and there's one person who's kind of clammed up and quiet. We've talked a lot about this in private. Oh, yeah. How do you handle the clammed up shell of people?
How you draw those players into the game and make sure that they are also enjoying it.
Exactly. Now it's like that, right? So you have someone who may not be clamming up and not talking. They're probably talking, they're into it and they're involved, but you're not exactly touching on the type of horror that really they dig or really gets under their skin, even in a fun way. And so if you're able to curate on an individual and tabletop level a kind of dynamic horror set in one game, that means that everybody's having a great time, everyone's buying into what you're doing, and ultimately it's going to be a better experience. I mean, you talked about the Kult game that we had last night. Emotional horror came out. I wasn't intending that to happen at all.
I know, but it did. But it was amazing.
And it was fantastic. I got goosebumps. At a certain point, I'm like, why am I feeling emotional? And this is because I was really keying into each and every player's own personal perspectives and needs in terms of horror.
Can I touch on that for a second?
Yeah, please.
Because I played in that game for the panelists, for the people watching who don't know what we're talking about. It was the Cult game we streamed last night. You did a fantastic job with that, because for a moment, once we got into like the climax of the session, the one shot, there was a moment where I was going, I don't know how my character is going to react to what's going on right now. Like I had to step back and think about it for a minute. And then I realized, no, that's exactly it. My character doesn't know how to react to what's going on. He's just, okay, well, life as normal. Let's just keep going. Like, I'm going to pretend this
Yeah.
isn't like pure chaos.
Yeah.
And that captured it beautifully, because there was an existential moment where my character was like, nope, shutting down. They're like, I'm going to make sure that this person's not bleeding out, and I'm going to do this and this.
And that's a real human reaction. That's how I react in emergency situations.
Yep.
I'm very like, okay, cool. All logic, all emotion goes deep, dark somewhere, and we'll deal with that later. And make sure that everyone is okay, everything is regulated, we're handling shit, whatever it is.
Yep.
And that's a defense mechanism, and that's how a lot of people react to real world horror and real life emergency situations. So it felt very natural when you did that.
Yeah,
Exactly what John just said in the chat. Fight, flight, or freeze.
Exactly. Yeah.
Brian. Sorry, Mark, were you done?
Yeah, finish up, Mark.
Yeah. No, please.
Okay.
Yeah, so why should we cultivate horror, right?
Yeah.
I have thought about tabletop games as the newest iteration of human oral history taking manifest.
Yeah.
And
awesome.
Horror has been a part of human oral tradition for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Some of the most scary stories you'll ever hear come from indigenous stories, and it's always cautions about something, maybe even behaviors in yourself, not necessarily a monster out there.
Yeah.
And so why should we cultivate horror? I think we should cultivate horror because if we only talk about the good things, we're doing a disservice to everyone around us, including ourselves. And we need to do it with respect and with consent. You need to make something horrifying, and that is a very intimate moment.
Yeah.
Incredibly intimate. I actually, the thing I'm thinking about now is the Monster Hearts 2 game.
No.
Because that was the most emotional game I've ever been in. I'm not going to go into details. Most emotional horror game I've ever been in, because it is a very personal horror game.
Yeah.
And it's about visceral reactions. But we should cultivate horror because in the right light, if you are willing, if the player is willing, it allows you to confront your fears. It allows you to confront trauma. It is an excellent tool for facing things down inside of yourself or things that you're scared about in the world. I think that it's a very valuable psychological tool, and it has been for me most certainly. And of course, beyond that, it's fun. We're all here to have fun. Yeah. At the end of it, we can have a laugh. We can have brevity because we had the moment of tension. We had our catharsis. So that's why I think we should cultivate horror, in things. It's a shared moment of necessary stress.
Rick?
I think cultivating horror is extremely important, especially for therapy and using it to better yourself. And it's strange to say those things together when talking about tabletop horror, right? But the reason behind them are, horror is one of those genres, especially when you're playing through it, when you're in this scenario, you're thinking critically, whether you know it or not. And you're going to develop those skills with any role-playing game, really. You're going to think critically. You're going to think outside the box and how you can solve certain problems. With horror, you typically have less options to work with. You're playing Alien and you don't have enough food, oxygen. Perhaps you're stressed. Actually, Alien's a great game to compare this to because you have so many different physical conditions that your person could be going through, and you have to role play that. You might be someone who's never really experienced true hunger or fear or panic, and now you're playing a game where you're having to put forth those emotions and dig deeper into facing things that you're not familiar with. That's scary too, right? But it's also a huge moment of personal growth, and it can be a personal challenge. So I think facing emotional vulnerability, especially with other people, it's one thing to watch, Sense and Sensibility alone while you're eating popcorn, being like, God damn you, Mr. Darcy, and you're crying. But being able to experience something where you're not quite comfortable, even in your own skin, even in the player that you're representing skin, and facing that in a collective storytelling way, it can take off the horse blinders a lot of us have in life and kind of open you up to more experiences, make you more welcoming to other people and the things that they go through. Maybe it can make you more empathic.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important. Also, recognizing patterns of behavior in fiction and in role playing is huge. You know, I am a very, I won't say gullible person, but I'm a very trusting person. I take people at face value, and I like to believe that those people mean well in everything they do. The world is not that simple. And tabletop role playing, especially in horror, when you're playing games where sometimes the other players can backstab you depending on what the game is, or even they don't have your best interests at heart. Sometimes the players get taken over by something else, and now they're having to act as an extension of that entity, like what happens in Kult sometimes. Recognizing some of these moves on the board, whether it's an NPC or PC, they can kind of help you prepare in real life to notice those things, to say, time out, let me think about what's really going on here. This is familiar to me. And, you know, that can be, it can be challenging, but in the end, I think you'll be safer for it. I think you'll think more critically about the people in your life. And if they're good for you, bad for you, maybe you have to cut them out of your life, or you recognize the patterns that are good in some people and you draw them in closer. But either way, it's wonderful because you're experiencing this and you're talking about it. We're talking about this right here because of horror tabletop gaming. And in and of itself, that's a great answer, having this very panel.
Absolutely. I don't know if I have much more to add to this one.
It's because I talk too much.
No, but between all three of you, between what I said to kick off the question, between what the three of you said, I think the only thing I have to add is that, to me, if I have to think harder, let me backtrack for a second. Not a lot scares me. That's one of the reasons I like horror games. So if I'm running a horror game for other people, not only do I want to be able to make sure that I'm not going too far, but it challenges me as a storyteller and a game master to curate the experience, as well as to, I think I can tell a better story by having to keep certain sensitivities in mind as I move forward. And I think that's something that even people who are like, I don't care about consent, I don't care about curating horror, I just want to tell the story that I want to tell, that's something that should appeal to them because it's a challenge. And to me, it makes it more engaging for me as the storyteller and the game master to have to think harder about it.
Yeah, it's a limitation that causes you to be more creative and kind of stretch those muscles. And if you're, because there are times where if you're running a game and you could just like show the monster at full view in all its goopiness, right? And you have to kind of step back and go, oh, wait a minute, you know, I should probably dial it back a little bit. And you are forced to use creative ways of describing around a creature that is far more scary in the minds of your player than whatever nonsensical description that you would give it. Almost
every horror movie is scarier when you can't see the monster.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
100%.
Yep. So I think I was watching spoilers for The Quiet Place, which is almost like how old movie now? At a certain point, it's like you don't see it. Okay, there it is. And I'm like, no, just don't let me see it through the entire movie. And there's a few other movies like that, and I apologize if anyone hasn't seen that, and that was a bad spoiler. But
they were ghosts the whole time, I think.
They were ghosts the whole time. Everyone was dead.
It was like that. It was like Dallas. It was all a dream.
Oh no. I think that, and Dixie just made a good statement too. I think everyone can see it. Consent in gaming, which we're going to talk about a little bit in here too, because I think that's part and parcel to the conversation we're having. Everyone has a better game when consent is on the table and lines and veils and safety tools are in use. End of the day, everyone has a better game. Because the worst thing that happened, and I know this is going to come up in like two points on our bullet point list here. End of the day, the worst thing that happens if you present someone with a consent form or ask for lines and veils and something that you really need in your game is on their list is, I don't think this is the right game for you. Let's help you find one that is for you. And now I can pull in a different player who's going to appreciate the story I want to tell more. That's the worst thing that can happen. And you can do that politely and respectfully. It's not hard.
So I like to think that I can kind of speak edgelord. And
yes, you can.
and every GM that has been like, these are stupid, this is ridiculous, like, why? Like, who cares? It's supposed to be an evil, scary, awful game. I'm going to be evil and scary and awful. It's hard for individuals like that to listen when you say, well, listen, you're being horrible, you're not being horrifying, to paraphrase Dixie over here in chat.
I was going to say, it's a shamelessly steal Dixie's line.
Yep. So, you know, if you explain it in a way of like, listen, you want to play a horrible, awful, scary game, I got you. Totally. I understand. Then why would you want people at your table that don't want to play that kind of game?
Right.
And if you're upfront about it, which is the reason why our consent form has a page 1, this is what the game is, this is what it's about, these are the themes, and are you okay with these themes, yes or no? And if they hit no, that's when you connect them with another game, or say, hey, listen, this might be too much for you.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So we've kind of already dived into it, so I'm just going to bring it up. How do you curate horror? Not just like, what tools do you use, but how do you then, if we're at a con game and you have a scenario written and it focuses on body horror and someone walks in and is like, I cannot deal with body horror. Now that might be a slightly different scenario where then we might just seat them at a different table. But, how do you make those adjustments that are necessary on the fly?
I've got a quick example, and then I'll pass it over to somebody. But for the Kult game that I was running on our Twitch channel, the game was supposed to start off with a suicide. It was supposed to start from a very graphic and awful and jarring suicide, which is scary and frightening, but also kind of gross. And there were the players that were involved. There were a couple of yellow lines, and I think someone had a red line on there. And I said, you know what? I have to change it, because I can't really do that to everybody, because it's just uncomfortable and weird. And so you just shift and you change, because this is collaborative storytelling, and you're GMing. I mean, anybody that says that they're running a game exactly how they wrote it down on their planning document is lying to you.
In fact, if they do say that, they probably don't have a planning document.
Right. So you change it. How do you do it? And the formalized consent helps.
Yep.
If you don't have that, then you just kind of have to learn how to read the room a little bit. Go by feel. I know that's a kind of a crappy answer, because some people might not have that, but
I can piggyback off that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would say that's not a bad answer, in that for me, I can either be I am either incredibly insightful or very dense. Nowhere between.
Accurate.
Nowhere between. Everyone can attest to this. I can just be like, yes, that's the problem, or like, there's a problem. So sometimes I am in Mark's shoes, where I'm just like, okay, I can work with this. Or other times, like, I have no idea. And I think at that point, you just kind of go, all right, everyone, time out. Let's have a quick conversation. Let's talk about this. Talk about what you're interested in seeing, not just what you're not interested in seeing. What are you interested in seeing? What kind of horror do you want right now? And just keep it short. Keep it simple. And when that person who's like, I can't do this, gives you that answer, you've listened to them. It helps them usually calm down, because you heard them and you're integrating it. It helps them feel better about the experience and know that you're going to respect them, because, maybe you have to take a moment to step aside and talk about it if it's something too sensitive. But either way, I think a conversation is not necessarily a bad option, so long as it's not directly in the middle of your game, in the middle of the scene.
Not even necessarily that. And that's, I'm going to interject very briefly and then let Rick tackle. People are very terrified of breaking immersion in tabletop gaming these days, and I understand why, but don't be, because in a situation where someone's enjoyment of the game is on the line, say, hey, I need to use the bathroom. I'm going to take a break and step away and let everyone decompress a little bit from whatever the scene was.
Yeah.
And then step back in and be like, let's talk about what's going on before we jump back into this game. That's not a bad tactic. I've used it before. Like, I even just make up an excuse to step away from the table for a second and think about what I was doing that maybe was starting to upset someone, and then I just come back to the table and be like, let's talk about this before we keep going.
I was actually having a conversation not too long ago about this very thing. It's the idea of metagaming as a kind of collaborative storytelling art form, and incorporating pieces of your tabletop game to talk about the game that you're playing. And there are some games where it's only that there's no RP. And there are different methodologies that you can kind of use to say, okay, we just had a scene. It was fairly intense. Let's talk about it. Let's shine a light on each different piece of it so that the GM knows how the characters are walking away from it, but also you kind of get a taste of how all the players are feeling.
Yeah.
It's like a scene by scene post-mortem.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Cool. All right.
You know, I like doing that, especially when, you know, we run games on Twitch and we'll have something. I'm going to just carry on with what you guys are saying before I answer your question, Ian. Sometimes when you get that halfway break before you go back live, that has given us a lot of good opportunity to be like, so how you guys liking it? You know, what about that last thing? What did you feel about that? You know, I think, you know, when we were playing V5, they got the character relation thing at the end, and you know, Ian was pretty good for a while, going on being like, how does your opinion change on this person, that person? I think those end of session recaps are really important.
Yeah.
Just to see where people are at, even from ST perspective, it might not have anything to do with story. You know, and it's hard to get away with that in a one shot, especially if you're at a con and things are constantly in motion. But that's a cool thing to do. On curating horror, I like what Bran was saying, and I think that asking for media examples as far as, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Player, what kind of examples of horror do you like? Like, because you obviously like horror. You came to this table, you came to this game. Provide me some examples of movies or different types of media that interest you. That way I can help curate that experience based on what I know that to be.
Right.
That still might end up in a miscommunication, so that could be tricky. One thing I like is, you know, we're talking about, okay, body horror, you know, that could be a huge red flag for someone, and now you have a pre-planned game with a certain flow on how this is going to happen. And Mark said something earlier that jump-started this idea in my head, but The Fly, Jeff Goldblum. The real horror of that movie is the middle stuff.
Yeah.
You know, he's a person, steps into this thing, shit happens. But then the middle of the movie where he's slowly turning into this awful thing, that's the grossest part. That's the most gut-wrenching body horror there is. Yeah. If the movie was just Jeff Goldblum steps in, he steps out, now he's a 6-foot fly that's zipping around town, and now it becomes kind of like the They or whatever with the giant ants.
Yeah.
Right? Or it becomes a mystery. How did this happen to Jeff Goldblum?
Yeah. Or the original Fly.
Right. You just removed the body horror aspect of it, and the game became something else. Yeah. That might not be the game you are intending to run or the right scenario, but maybe taking a piece out that bothers them and seeing what else you can put in its place. But think about how that's going to change the dynamic of your game, and if it's still within reason that they would want to play that, as well as the other players.
That's where liminality comes in. I mean, I think it's kind of what you're touching on is the liminal aspect of horror, and with liminal elements, there are ripe opportunities to change and morph, and everything is squishy. You can malform it how you will.
Yeah. My last point to that is, while the game is in motion, I like to put certain things on the table or in the scene. And you're going to get to know your players fairly quickly by who takes that bait. If you have a player that is like, oh, no, I'm not going anywhere near that, it could be, they could be RPing their character well, or it could be that they're not comfortable confronting that. Or they're just like, that could be a sign. you know, especially if it happens a lot. Maybe there's playing a cowardly character, but it's something to take into consideration. Maybe the things you're presenting to that player are a little too much. Like, try stepping down the next threat that you're sending their way, or send them something different. Do they react to it differently? That's kind of how on the fly. It's kind of like when you're the music engineer and you've got different dials and knobs, you're trying to get the sound just right. Kind of have to do that for every player at the table. It's a lot of insight that you've got to put into that, and it can be hard when you're trying to tell a story. But that makes a good game master, I think.
And I think my last note on this, you have to do that for the individual players, but you also have to do it for the table as a whole. I have certainly been in a situation where I'm describing a one-on-one scene with one player, and I can see another player getting uncomfortable out of the corner of my eye. And I'm going to adjust that, because it's like, if that, even though your character is not involved, if simply having it described in front of you is problematic, I can adjust. The one thing, Mark, you said this earlier, and I think it's an important thing to piggyback off of, is learning to read the room, and learning to not just, having informed consent, but also learning to recognize how people are reacting in the moment. And there's tons of videos online. I'm not going to try to teach you people how to read the room right now, but there's tons of resources you can do to improve at doing that, and just being able to recognize how people feel by their facial reactions and their body mannerisms, body language. That's the word I was trying to think of. Yeah,
there's all the nonverbals and the positions and
nonverbal communication.
Yeah, and accidental nonverbals, like the position of their body, and when people are talking in a group, right? And if you could, this is a fun little trick. When there's a bunch of people standing in a group and they're talking to each other, look at everybody's feet and see where they're pointing. And it could track either who they're most interested in speaking with, or if they're distracted with something else and want to leave the conversation, their feet will be pointed a different way. Or when people are kind of laughing, if there's joking around, they'll look at the person that they feel most comfortable with. And the same thing goes for aversion. There's certain tells that people have, and we all have it. We all have these little tells, and there's, like Ian said, a million little videos all over the place on how to read body language. I wish I had a name of like a YouTuber that did just this, but I don't know.
That'd be a good resource to pull together for something. I wanna dovetail, and I know we had a bullet point list of things we want to talk about. I want to skip our fifth one after a very brief conversation, because A, there was an entire panel on it earlier this evening, and B, we kind of already touched on it heavily, which is formalizing consent at the table. It's very important, particularly in horror games, for all the stuff we talked about earlier, as well as everything that was discussed in the Consent in Gaming panel earlier today, which was fantastic. And if you missed it when Bodana Group posts it to YouTube, I highly recommend you watch it. So I want to jump over and I want to talk about everyone's least favorite type of horror, jump scares. And it's kind of the thing we were talking about with, showing the horror, and when you show the horror and how you don't. I hate jump scares because they're not scary. Like, I am startled if I stream horror video games all the time. I will sit down and play a game like Outlast, and I'll be playing and something will leap out of the darkness into my face and I jump, but it's not scary to me. It doesn't derive any emotional reaction. It's a physical reaction. It's a fight or flight reaction. And I don't use them in my tabletop gaming at all. So that's all I have to say about this subject, Mark.
So this is probably a bad habit of mine, but I like to jump around corners and scare my family members.
You're a horrible person now.
Yeah, it's a startling thing, and it's not. I don't really see it as anything that's like, if you're like, I don't know, if you're at a tabletop and you're like clapping in people's face, and it's so weird to include that in your games, and it feels very like it feels like 12-year-olds sitting around a campfire and telling ghost stories, which is fine for 12-year-olds sitting around a campfire telling ghost stories. But when you're telling a tabletop game, that kind of method doesn't really quite translate well.
I will say you brought up audio cues, and I do use those. Sometimes I will like smack my hand on the table and be like, and the door slams, bam, because there's a memory associated with that. Everyone knows what the sound of a door slamming sounds like, and so creating the sound is because I'm a very audio
Sure.
person more than a visual person.
Yes.
I do think there's value in that, but not using it as a scare tactic.
Yeah, and there's also this is my final thing I'm going to say about this because I'm not qualified to speak on this whatsoever. But I don't know if there's, and I imagine that there probably is certain people that we talked about the fight or flight response, that when you do that in a game to strangers that you don't know or that you don't know that well at say like a convention game, you could be, say if they're a veteran, for example. And you're triggering some major PTSD from somebody who, I don't know, was at war. You're kind of,
I could probably talk about that actually.
Yeah, please.
So, obviously the symptoms of various different mental health things, overlap and vary and such, but I have sensory processing disorder type stuff from ADHD, and sudden loud noises can send me into really bad places. Not as bad as, let's say, PTSD, as say like PTSD from like a war, but I know people who have that problem where a sudden loud noise that they are not expecting, especially if they're not looking at the source of the noise, can startle them and remove them completely from the moment and send them somewhere else. You can destroy their immersion if you're not aware of that trigger.
Exactly.
And it takes them a lot of work to come back down. You've basically ruined the game for them. So for me, we're talking about jump scares, is I don't use jump scares, but I think that a jump scare is literally the same thing as dogs play fighting. I think it's humans teaching each other about shock response and about being scared. Kids do it a lot. Kids jump scare all the time, and like the child in you wants to jump scare other people.
Yeah,
like it's very childlike, I think. So I think it's play, but it's more physical play than it is anything else. So in a story, while I don't use jump scares, I'll kind of capitalize on the surprise element because I'll change the tone of my voice. Like be talking really quiet, and the music will be really quiet, and just like to be really quiet and intimate and immersive, and kind of let everyone kind of lean in, and then do a sudden shift of tone. Not shouting in their faces, but it's the nearest thing I think at a table to a quality jump scare.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's an awesome way to do that.
It's really hard because it doesn't work with every group, but when it does work, it's a lot of fun, and people don't hate it. They're just like, oh, because it's a sudden tonal shift.
You also have those dulcet tones that
this is why we tag your Wednesday night stream as ASMR.
I could listen to you talk for days, and even if you are throwing some little like jump scares at me, ooh, thanks, Bran. Keep going.
No problem, you got it. But so I mean, I definitely think that jump scares don't have don't have a casual place at the table. But like Ian was saying, the door slams. I think it's definitely, again, a part of consent. Make sure everyone's aware that, hey, there might be sudden loud noises in this game. Shouldn't be so loud as to make you think a gunshot went off. But
I literally just wwrote a note to myself. Make sure we add, are you okay with sudden loud noises to our consent forms? Because it's not on there currently. I was just
thinking that. I was just like, oh, crap.
All the instances I was thinking of where I've done it is when I'm playing with people I know. Yeah, it's a different situation usually. But yeah, I was like,
Yeah, I think that the slow reveal is more fun anyway, personally, rather than the shock reveal. But hey, so I'm done.
No, Rick.
Perfect segue. I was going to get into. I don't like jump scares because they're lame, and for all of the psychological reasons we talked about, I like the introduction of something big, slowly, softly. I like when there is a pause where my players are not talking, and I just go, and then the door slams. And through it, something you can't describe steps foot into the house. That's much better than some yuckage going, ah, damn it, and slapping the table. I mean, It's like an alien when it's on the ceiling, and it's very perfectly like doing a yoga thing where it just uncoils itself and then slowly descends.
Yeah.
Gracefully. That, in a sense, is still kind of like, it's the opposite of a jump scare, but it gets the effect of a jump scare that the jump scare just doesn't have. It doesn't have the same quality. It's the introduction of something big and threatening without relying on startling someone that could take that psychologically bad.
That's often how I introduce horrors in Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah.
There's this moment where people are just like, wait, something in this room changed or is different. And then they see content warning spiders, a dressmaker dummy that has sprouted mechanical spider legs clinging to the ceiling, just kind of looking at them.
Oh, I like that. I like it a lot.
Sorry. Anyway, continue.
I think that there's also the difference between the language of cinema, which jump scares lend itself to. It's very, it's very film, right? Very film specific. So trying to translate that in other forms of media kind of have a little bit of like a square peg round hole kind of problem. Because I'm thinking of there's a moment in Hereditary, and Hereditary is a very slow burn. It's a very emotional horror, but the apex of the film is it's a fever dream, and it is scary, and there's a bunch of different little jump scares, and the way what's that?
I still haven't finished that movie.
Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil anything.
I know.
But the way that they handle these little jump scares are in these vignettes, and it's very like the language of cinema. And I would love to translate some of that in some of my games. But to be perfectly honest, the times where I've hinted at it or tried or experimented with it, it just comes out kind of lame.
I've always struggled with the concept of shocking someone in a tabletop game as opposed to surprising them. And I think that's kind of where that difference lies.
Yeah.
Enough about jump scares, but I think you summed it up really well with it just being like, jump scares work in cinema. They don't really work in the bardic storytelling style of horror.
Bardic, I like that.
Well, you said
the real jump scare is rolling poorly.
Yes,
that is always the true horror. Yes. Well, no, actually, it was funny because earlier Bran said, tabletop gaming is the new narrative storytelling. I can't remember exactly what you said, but like audio,
oral tradition,
and that I immediately think of bards, and that's what bards are. And
my last name growing up means Bard of the King.
Come on,
I'm aware.
So cool.
I'm like, yeah.
We're almost at the written time for this panel, but we are going to keep going if all our panelists are okay with that.
I'm okay with it. I hope our participants, the people that are attending and watching, if you're okay with it, hang out.
Yeah. It is recorded, so
yeah, if you got to bounce, this will come out afterwards.
So, Mark, you brought up edgelords earlier and edgelording. And I have a favorite term for it, which I have shamelessly stolen from a friend of mine, which is pizza cutter. All edge, no point.
Yes.
And particularly in horror gaming, it's a problem. And I think everyone knows it's a problem. As soon as the consent in gaming topic started becoming more widely discussed, they all rose to the surface to voice their complaints.
Yeah.
And we talked about this earlier with learning how to read the room, but I think there's more to it when you try to not do that. You don't want, when you don't want to be an edgelord and you accidentally become one because you get so wrapped up in the story you're telling, or some of the players are into it and some aren't. How do you avoid doing that?
I was a very scared child. I was afraid of everything. There were a lot of reasons for that, but I had a lot of
surprises me.
Yeah, I had nightmares, and it was awful for a long time. And I was a scared kid. It was kind of it was a running joke in my family of like, oh God, careful, Mark gets scared at movies, right? And so over a period of time, I think I kind of just decided to start exposing myself to various aspects of horror, or things that scared me, to try to get myself less scared of it, right? Like it's kind of self-induced exposure therapy without understanding exactly what I was doing. So I have been exposed to a lot of different kinds of horror, and some that might be extreme for others and not so extreme for some. And like I said, I guess, like I said, I can kind of speak edgelord because I understand where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
It's the, well, why are you so sensitive? Like I've gone through all of this and I've seen all these things and I have, played all these games, and it's not that big of a deal. But it is not that big of a deal to you, but it probably is to other people. And it's a lack of empathy. Yep. And it's a lack of understanding that there are other people that are different than you in this universe, and that you need to be mindful of that. And it's hard to be mindful of that.
It can be. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, I think a lot of people forget that no one else shares their lived experience. The people who struggle with this, they just don't realize it. For some reason.
Yeah, it's normalized, and I also suffer from big mouth syndrome. So I'm a loudmouth, and I say things, and so and edgelords tend to also have this similar problem. But the issue is that they don't make these connections to understand that. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is something that you should work on to improve or cultivate that in the proper channels in order to become the best horror storyteller that you can be. Because now you have a toolbox that you can pull out your little tricks or little tips or things that may not be scary to you, but are definitely something's going to affect other people in a fun, interesting way. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, the best thing that you could probably do is just use mindfulness in your game development while you're developing the scenario, or if you're shooting from the hip and actually playing and just kind of it's a little more free form. Use mindfulness while you're going. No one cares about your big moment reveal. Like no one really cares about this. I got this plan and I'm finally going to say it. And, I'm going to tell them that the guy over here is actually a horrible monster. And this is what it's going to look like. And it's totally going to shock everybody. And aren't I wonderful? No one really cares. Like those moments are less important to the players than the moments of connecting with the other people at the table, or really finding an emotional connection to the game. Your master plan of your scariest scenario ever that's going to scare the pants off of anybody is going to fall flat, and you're going to feel like a failure afterwards because you weren't being mindful of it.
Mm-hmm. I think everything you just said harkens back to what we were discussing earlier about you'll be a better storyteller and a better GM if you challenge yourself to curate the content that you're delivering.
So can you repeat the question?
Yeah. How do you avoid being a pizza cutter, being an edgelord, especially when you've already stumbled a little bit too far in that direction because you were caught up in the moment?
I think that the best way to avoid that, being a pizza cutter, being too edgy, is go into the entire experience ahead of time, knowing that tabletop gaming, even when you are the game master, is a conversation. It isn't a lecture. You don't superimpose things at people. You don't just slam it in their face. You don't deliver it to them unless they want it delivered. It's a conversation. It goes both ways. If you do not pause to listen to the things they aren't saying and the things that they are saying, you're not really in it for being a game master. You're in it for being in control. And that's the wrong reason. I think that you're going to find you're going to have a lot more fun when you listen to people. You're going to really enjoy it, and you're going to find that you connect with people and that you share more in common with them than you thought. And that while you might not feel sensitive about these particular topics, it's because you have put yourself through the rigors of them. You have endured them, and all of that pain doesn't make you less relatable. It makes you more relatable if you take the time to listen and hear other people. And I would say that's how you avoid it.
I agree 100%. I want to touch on what Bran said very briefly because it segues really, really well into my answer, and then I'll let you jump on it. This grenade, Rick.
Sure.
that was actually a hard lesson for me to learn initially. Like I said earlier, there's very little in this world that scares me, which makes horror a very interesting genre. And it took me a really long time to learn the difference between that's a good thing and I can use it to tell better stories versus I can't tell these stories because the story I want to tell is too scary for everyone else. Sort of. There's a very important distinction there. And it's not that you can't tell the story, it's that you can tell a better story if you are mindful of how to share that story.
I fully agree.
Rick.
Learning from the mistakes of other people. If you have not been an edgelord, hopefully you haven't, right? Because we have a lot of people who are new storytellers, and we encourage them to be the best storytellers they can be, obviously. But there are some people who might not have veered into the waters of being an edgelord yet. And to those people that don't have that experiential relevance, I would say that there are unfortunately almost too many examples of games you can watch where something has gone horribly wrong. Mm-hmm. And watch those. Learn from those examples, listen to what the players said and their complaints, because these situations that you will look for are the reasons why we have panels like we have today and consent forms. Mm-hmm. To use the old adage, you can learn a lot from a dummy. Please do. Avoid those same pitfalls. Call it tradition, call it whatever you want, but learning how to avoid those issues without doing them yourselves is going to save you a lot of frustration, and it's going to save your players a lot of frustration. I think Bran's point about how storytelling is a collaborative event, right? As a storyteller, I come up with things that I have scenes, I have a story set in mind, but I always keep in mind that I am here to provide a response to the decisions that the players are making. It's not you're Spielberg and I don't care if you're Brad Pitt, you're doing the scene. No, it's different. It's a collaboration, a true collaboration, which means you have to have the willingness and the communication to make this happen. You know, if you had something amazing set in mind and your players don't get to it because they go off the rails, right? Maybe they get too sandboxy. Don't try to force them back on the rails. See where it goes. And then at the end of the session, be like, that went different than what I thought. And if you don't plan on using that idea in the future, be like, here's what I had. And then talk about it, because that's cool too. Just because they didn't play through it, their characters didn't experience it, does not mean that those players are not going to appreciate that idea. They might even take that and be like, man, if I storytell, I'm going to do that sometime. That's awesome, you know? And you're going to feel just as good about that as if they ran through that in the scenario. And that's okay. It's not, you're not losing anything by cutting something out of what you had planned. Because the importance is that they're having a good time.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we have a question from...
we do.
One more thing before we get into that.
Yeah.
The games that we've been playing lately, like Great American Witch and 10 Candles, they have a cool mechanic where the players get to introduce a truth to the game. And the person who's running the game allows the player to be like, okay, now you can say whatever, and that's going to be canon in the scenario, right?
Yeah.
I think everyone should play a game like that once if you're a storyteller, because it keeps it in mind that your players and everything they do, whether you're telling them, okay, you know, you get to introduce truth now. Dude, they've been introducing truths since the minute they started talking as players. They are affecting the story, the setting, the reality, and games like those two that I mentioned go out of their way to say that matters. Give them time to have creative input outside of themselves.
100%.
That's awesome stuff.
It really is. So we did just get a really good, but also very difficult to answer question, at least for me, which was how do you choose what to replace, and how do you adjust on the fly? Like, not okay, you adjust on the fly, but like, how do you actually adapt to what's going on in the moment when you don't have time to say, okay, I need to rewrite part of this scenario? We experience this a lot with our con games because often your players are already sitting at the table, they're already in their allotted time for their game when they fill out their consent form, and now you're going, well, I have to completely change the middle of this scenario, or the introduction to this scenario, or the end of this scenario, or I have to change something on one of the pre-gen character sheets. That's even happened. So like, best tips and practices for improvising very rapidly when you have to adjust a core piece, or not even necessarily a core piece, but a plot hook in a story that you want to tell.
That's a damn good question.
It is, and it's a really hard one for me to answer because the how is the hard part.
So what I can say is that if you integrate some I guess fail safes in your game ahead of time. For example, let's just say it's a modern game and it takes place in a entire city. Let's just say, there are different areas and different buildings that have different things going on in each involving the story, right? You do that for plot, right? There's different characters that do different things, but you can also do that for tone. Things like, creepy crawlies and scary, bugs and slimy, gross things can exist in a forest-like atmosphere. And so when you have a player who's like, hard no spiders, no creepy crawlies, none of that, and no thank you, then they just never find their way there. Or just take it out completely and have the mystery of the forest and how creepy it is. And they're probably thinking to themselves already, I hope there's not bugs. I hope there's not bugs. And you don't have to include that piece in there. You could just kind of take it out while still having the surroundings. How do you, with a core piece, do that on the fly? The best way is to cheat a little bit. If you are running a horror game, you probably like horror movies, at least some thrillers, at the very least, something involving horror. So you have these scenes in mind, you have these plots in mind that you know and love from all of your favorite horror movies. If you need to kind of dip into that little bag of plot hooks and put that into your game, go for it. I know Texas Chainsaw Massacre like the back of my hand because I've seen it so many times. It's one of my favorite movies. For you, it might be, I don't know, Event Horizon, right? Two slightly different movies, right? And you could just take it and just kind of mix and match, or just take some of your favorite pieces and go, I don't have a central plot, but I do know this movie and I can kind of incorporate some of that. That sounds like a cheat, but they won't know.
and just to piggyback off the idea that like a lot of people who might enjoy horror tabletop games don't watch horror movies. Thrillers like Along Came a Spider, or Seven's kind of horror, but Seven, or
Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Dracula. There's these themes are in a lot of movies that are not hard horror. So you can pull from other things. You can pull from comedy. Actually, there's a lot of comedy that crosses lines with horror in some cases.
I kind of also sometimes enjoy a little bit of freeform. and this is not for everybody, but and we talk a lot about Kult here, and I guess because it's right now my current obsession, but there's a kind of a one-shot scenario that they've given out to everybody. It's a rules light
The Driver.
It's called The Driver. It's a one-on-one scenario that you can essentially just say, okay, here's my character, this is what they got, and let's go. What do you do? Where do you go? And together, you and the other player explore a horrifying scenario, and neither one of you even know what the story is. You're just kind of Ouija boarding your way through the game, and you could do that with multiple people.
I think that when you talk about storytelling, I think that the terms that are used in writing come into play as well. Pantsing. you know, not having a direct plot of where you're going with this thing and just writing it. I think that is like, you know, like Mark was just saying, you know, like the Ouija board. You can be flexible. You can follow. You can basically treat it like an adventure, you know, with you and everyone else. You're all driving. You're all going. And while you might have final say as the arbiter or whatever, you know, you're not taking away their agency. You're just refining it. You're focusing what they're doing into something else. So if you have to change out a whole part of your adventure, your scenario, for me, the way that I tend to do it is I try my best before the game, because I've been a pantser for a long time, to just kind of go through not the scenario, but the setting in my head. Just kind of like chew on it, go through it, write out some things here and there, you know, just like in the weeks coming up to it. Because if you feel intimately connected with that setting in some way, shape, or form, it's not going to be hard for you to make that change. You'll be able to go, this is plausible right here, and this will feel good, you know, based on what you're reading from the other players. So for me, my wholehearted recommendation to anyone struggling with knowing what to replace is do your mental exercises before game. Just kind of like, you know, be what's the word I'm looking for here? Be languid in your approach. Don't assume that the thing that is written, that the thing is in the adventure is going to happen, because sometimes the players will take such an averse set of actions to that event that it will feel jarring to bring it in anyway.
Yeah.
So like it might not even be a consent issue. It might just be that they're really creative. Don't hold them back. Go with them. Journey with them into this random realm of imagination. You're just the guide. You're able to say, oh, well, that thing over there, that is you know, that's this thing. You're the little boat guide and they're driving.
Yeah. It's like that meme with like, you know, it's a throwaway character you just threw in because they wanted to go into a shop, and there's a little goblin that you come up with a funny voice, and now you're stuck with that funny voice,
right?
Because they fall in love with the character and bring him around, and now that's like the mainstay of the adventure.
That happened to me once. Yeah, that happened to me once in a D&D game. I introduced a peasant that they had to escort back to his farm, and he had no name, and they decided they were going to train him to be an adventurer.
Yes.
that literally happened with these two and the other players in my home V5 game with a Second Inquisition character I named Todd on the fly.
Todd.
Todd. Rick.
So I like to view sometimes when if you have a lot more time to plan it out, and there's something you can take on the fly, or even this can work on the fly, because that was really the question. View your adventure sometimes as modular. If there's something coming up, and Dixie kind of mentioned it with her question, what do you take out? Well, my advice, use what you know. If you've run another game before, think of another setting or situation that you've already run, because what you're already familiar with is going to be much more easy to seamlessly put into this adventure. If you've already run it before, if you're already familiar with it, if you don't have to think too much about what it is they're looking at, experiencing, because you've already described it another time before, or perhaps written it. That way you're not inventing anything on the fly. You're using something that you already have in your arsenal. You're just pulling another arrow out of the quiver. So that is my piece of advice for that little piece. The second piece of advice is, and you know, Brandon Marchosi has talked about it a little bit with, if it's a monster, and it's a spider, do you switch it to like a mammal, like a bear? You know, it's not always that cut and dry, but that is an answer, right?
Yeah.
But what if it's not a monster? What if it's something like a fear, like claustrophobia?
Yeah.
And it's like, shit. Well, that was a huge part. They're walking into a small boiler room. I can't necessarily change the scene. They're already there. You know, and luckily these guys talk and they have great ideas. So it allows the guy who's in the back of the bus to think a little more about his answers. But what I came up with is use the polar opposite of what's going on. They're afraid of X, make it Y.
Yeah.
Yeah.
this person's claustrophobic. You can't take them out of that setting, or can you? All of a sudden you're feeling lightheaded. You know, it is a small room. Your character loses consciousness for a moment. And instead of it being someplace really confined, what if they wake up in their own headspace? Maybe it's a quick fever dream of some kind, and they're looking into like basically infinity. It's a room,
nothingness. Yeah.
It's a room it expands forever.
Endless. Yeah.
And they confront something that maybe they would have confronted in that room anyway. And what's really happening is this person that they were supposed to meet is standing over them, talking to them. Maybe it wasn't an enemy. Maybe it's just a room that was creepy. And that's all it was meant to be. It was meant to build tension. Maybe there is an actual threat there, but this player is considering it a threat because that's what they're really afraid of. Yeah. Well, then that NPC or whatever that character is trying to help them up, trying to get them back on their feet, maybe picking them up fireman's carry style and carrying them out of a smaller room into a place where the player and the character are going to feel more comfortable.
Have you ever seen THX 1138?
I have not.
So it's George Lucas, obviously directed Star
American
Wars.
Graffiti.
Yes, American Graffiti, and a lot of the actors from American Graffiti were in THX 1138, and it's kind of like a mix of 1984 and Brave New World. Yeah. But there's a scene; it's very futuristic. There's a scene where the main character ends up in prison, but I think he calls it the endless prison or the wall-less prison, and essentially it's all white, and there is nothing for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. And the scene itself is very, very simple. They're just sitting in a white room with no walls. And it feels both claustrophobic and ever expansive. Mm-hmm. So it also feels neither claustrophobic or ever expansive. So that, and this is a scene that I've used in game for this very reason, that someone might be uncomfortable with closing in walls. You can kind of open up the walls while still making it feel very unnerving.
There's I'll shill it till my dying breath. My favorite podcast, the Magnus Archives, centrally focuses on different primal fears. Claustrophobia, the fear of being hunted, or the fear of being prey. And one of the fears is the vast. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what it is, and it's the polar opposite. It's just nothingness, which is a very existential fear. That's actually one of the ways I approach it. I think this is a very difficult question for me to answer because spoilers for how I run games, they're probably 80% improv. I write like a very, very brief outline and then I just go with it and I riff off of what the players are giving me. But if something I can adapt on the fly very quickly is just substituting existential fear. If someone is afraid of being buried alive or afraid of spiders, I literally just swap out another fear. It's suddenly heights. It's it's something that they can still understand is a terrifying experience, but won't necessarily be a bad experience for the player. That gets harder when you're talking about like really specific things. Like if you have an entire scenario written around like cult sacrifice or body horror, that gets challenging. But
it does, and I've had that happen with religion.
Yeah,
where I had two players at a convention that didn't want any religious iconography or any kind of like religious horror, and I don't know what the backstory is. It could be religious. I don't know. It's just something it was a very hard, like, no, thank you. And my scenario was
like 180%.
Mostly. Yeah. And so it's like, well, okay, cool. It's no longer a cult now. It's just a group of people that are doing nefarious things. And any like religious scenery, it's no longer a church. It's now a school, and you just have to do that. You have to do that separating and subtracting and adding.
That adds a new element of speculation, I think, because people, start to go, oh, it's not a cult. I don't know what it is. Like, what's going on here, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes it better, right? Like it
can.
Yeah. The limitation allowed you to create essentially a better game.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that is it for us, gentlemen. I want to thank Banana Group for inviting us to run this panel as part of Save Against Fear 2020. It's very exciting. We've been having a blast running games and doing all the things that we do through this convention. You can find all of us at gehennagaming.com. From gehennagaming.com, you will find all the links to all the places. We run a very large Discord community. We stream on Twitch almost every day of the week, soon to be every day of the week. We have a ton of video content over on YouTube. We have a podcast. We have, I don't know, we don't have a Snapchat yet.
Give me time.
Yeah, I know.
I will start the
marketing.
TikTok dances very shortly. No, I won't.
You're gonna start with Thriller, right?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
I mean,
Just make sure
okay,
it's
that one
Fleetwood Mac in it, right?
I'll participate in that one.
We'll get as many people as possible to participate in that massive.
A flash mob thriller dance.
so
I'm okay with
Yeah.
this. Personally, you can find me online at Ravnos. That's all you need to know. Mark?
Yeah, Mark Q Anderson. You could find me on Twitter at Marchosius with 5s instead of S's. I'm more concerned about you actually just following Gehenna Gaming and all the cool stuff that we do. Joining our Discord, there's a lot of amazing people over there. Some of you are actually in chat, and we love you all. Honestly, this is a fun hobby and it's a fun job, and there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with it, and I'm super excited that more people now than ever are super keyed into horror and tabletop. So thank you so much, and
yes.
keep donating to SafeCon 2020.
Bran?
And I am Bran. You can find me on Gehenna Gaming, on our Discord. If you join us via the website, the link's in there. Or you can also follow me on Twitter at Kathakaros, that's spelled with K's. And if you can't find me there, that's fine. We'll meet up. We'll meet up. Just join our Discord. It's a good place.
Rick?
Hi. You can find me at Def Malkavian, DEF Malkavian, or
Got his
Wheeler. It's on my shirt. It's official Redbubble on its fan. Anyway, thank you for everyone who joined us, especially our good friend Dixie Cochran for her wonderful questions, and for everyone who joined Bohana Group, donated, and played in some amazing games. We have more tomorrow. We could list them off for you if we wanted, but I don't know if we will.
Are you talking
Chronicles
about
of Darkness, Mortals, Little Fears, 10 Candles, and Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition Dark Ages conversion, which is a staple for any convention that we run games at. You can catch all of those tomorrow, as well as a closing conversation between myself and Jack from Bodana Group over on twitch.tv/Gehenna Gaming.
You're so good.
I actually have the schedule up on my other monitor, so I can do that.
Of course you do.
I'm like, oh, he's doing this from his memory. Man, that's amazing.
I have it up. So again, thank you everyone for joining this panel. You've been wonderful. I'm going to stop recording and we can keep talking for 5 minutes because apparently that doesn't kick anyone out.